There are truths that don't ask permission to enter. They pierce the mind like silent blades, not to wound, but to separate illusion from reality. If you continue reading, accept one thing from the start. Nothing that follows is meant to comfort. It's meant to awaken. Machiavelli never wrote for the righteous nor for the well-intentioned. He wrote for the attentive. For those who suspect that the world doesn't work the way we were taught, but continue to pretend to believe in order to avoid facing the weight of lucidity. Imagine a man observing everything from a distance, not as a judge, not as a savior, but as an anatomist of the human soul. Machiavelli doesn't try to change man, he describes him, and there's something profoundly stoic in that, accepting the nature of things as they are, not as we would like them to be. Where the majority revolts, he notes. Where many moralize, he calculates. Where almost everyone is deluded, he remains cold, aware, present. This is where most people back down, because seeing reality requires courage. It requires abandoning the fantasy that good intentions are enough, that the world rewards those who are righteous, that character alone protects someone from betrayal, contempt, or loss. The Stoic learns early on that he does not control the external world. Machiavelli adds something even more uncomfortable. Those who do not understand the external world end up being controlled by it. Ask yourself with brutal honesty, how many decisions have you made believing that people would act logically, fairly, or gratefully, and been surprised? How many times have you given your trust expecting reciprocity? How many times have you been loyal to ideas, people, or institutions that were never loyal to you? Machiavelli observed this pattern centuries before you were born, not as an occasional mistake, but as a silent rule of human coexistence. There's a reason why his name still causes discomfort. It's not because he advocated evil, it's because he rejected convenient lies. He understood that the common man prefers stories that make him feel good to truths that force him to be strong. The Stoic would say this stems from the fear of pain. Machiavelli would agree, but would go further. The fear of pain makes man accept almost any narrative, as long as it eases his conscience. Observe the world around you carefully. People say they value the truth, but punish those who speak it. They say they admire strength, but feel threatened by it. They say they respect discipline, but prefer the company of those who validate their weaknesses. This is not isolated hypocrisy. It's structure. It's a pattern. It's human nature functioning exactly as Machiavelli described. And here arises the first question that few dare to ask. If the world works this way, what happens to those who insist on acting as if it didn't? Stoicism answers, this man will suffer because he expects from the world something that the world did not promise. Machiavelli adds, besides suffering, he will be used, ignored, or discarded because he does not understand the real rules of the game that everyone pretends not to play. Machiavelli doesn't ask you to become cruel. He asks you to become lucid. There's a profound difference between wickedness and clarity. Wickedness is born from the pleasure of hurting. Clarity is born from the refusal to be deceived. The lucid man doesn't revolt against human nature. He incorporates it into his understanding of the world. He doesn't demand that others be better. He demands that he himself be more attentive. Perhaps you are feeling a slight discomfort now, a silent resistance. That's good. It's a sign that something real is being touched. The Stoic would recognize this moment as the beginning of inner mastery, when emotion arises, but does not govern. Machiavelli would recognize it as the exact instant when the illusion begins to crumble. There's something almost no one realizes. Machiavelli doesn't write for immediate power, but for long-term survival. He speaks to the man who wishes to remain whole in an unstable world. To the man who understands that virtue without perception becomes vulnerability. To the man who prefers to bear the weight of truth rather than live anesthetized by comfortable lies. Reflect on this calmly. Who you have become to survive socially may not be who you need to be to remain relevant, respected, or safe. Many people confuse adaptation with submission, kindness with passivity, peace with the absence of confrontation. Machiavelli observes these confusions as someone who has seen the outcome countless times. The Stoic, in turn, understands that the confusion arises from attachment to image, to approval, to the need to be seen as good. What if the greatest prison wasn't external but mental? What if true weakness lay not in a lack of resources, but in a refusal to see how things really work? Machiavelli never promises tranquility. He offers something rarer, guidance amidst chaos. Not a ready-made moral code, but a map. Not a promise, but a silent warning. At this point, many close the book. Many change the channel. Many prefer to return to gentler narratives, where the world makes sense and effort is automatically rewarded. Machiavelli knew this. The Stoic knew this too. Both understood that most people don't seek truth, they seek relief, and relief rarely transforms anyone. If you're still here, something in you has already realized that there's a deeper layer beneath human interactions. An unspoken, yet felt logic. A silent game where emotions, appearances, and interests intertwine. Machiavelli didn't create this game. He simply had the courage to describe it unapologetically. And now comes the question that separates casual readers from real observers. Do you prefer to continue believing that the world should be different? Or are you willing to understand it as it is, and then consciously choose how to act within it? This is not a conclusion. It is an opening, a threshold, the exact point at which man ceases to be merely another reactant to events and begins to become someone who observes before acting. Machiavelli is there, silently, not to push you but to remind you. Whoever does not understand human nature will always be governed by it, and from here on, nothing you observe will ever be seen in the same way again. You may believe you decide with your head, but almost everything within you is first decided by your body. A knot in your stomach, a silent discomfort, a vague expectation of pleasure or fear. Only after that does the mind enter the scene. Not to choose, but to justify. Machiavelli observed this mechanism with surgical coldness, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. He saw rational men only in discourse. In practice, he saw emotional creatures trying to alleviate internal tensions, avoid immediate pain, and preserve a comfortable image of themselves. Think of something simple and everyday. Someone asks for your opinion, says they want to hear the truth. You speak clearly, without aggression, pointing out a path that requires effort. The reaction is not gratitude, it's defensiveness. The face closes, the tone changes, the conversation ends. Days later, that same person makes the opposite decision, based on impulse, and suffers the consequences. Even so, they prefer the known pain to the discomfort of change. Machiavelli saw this as the rule, not the exception. The Stoic accepts this. Man chooses what seems bearable to him now, even if it costs him dearly later. There's a recurring image that spans centuries. The man who complains about his job, his boss, the lack of recognition, but repeats the same actions every day that keep him exactly where he is. He knows what he should be doing. You've heard advice, read books, watched videos. The problem has never been information. The problem is that change requires facing the fear of losing identity, routine, and belonging. Machiavelli understood that the fear of immediate pain always wins over distant benefits. That's why he didn't write for those seeking comfort, but for those willing to face this truth without looking away. Observe personal relationships. How many times have you seen someone remain in a relationship that clearly wears them down, simply because the idea of being alone seems more threatening than the daily pain? Pretty words are used to justify decisions born from fear. It's complicated. Nobody's perfect. It will get better. Machiavelli saw beyond the phrases. He saw the internal drive, avoiding emptiness, avoiding rupture, avoiding the responsibility of choosing something different. The Stoic would recognize this as attachment. Machiavelli would call it human predictability. There's an almost invisible point where emotion takes complete control, and few realize when they cross that line. It's when a person starts defending their choices not because they are good, but because they've already been made. Reason ceases to be a guide and becomes an advocate. It justifies, protects, distorts. Machiavelli noted this with disconcerting precision. He knew that, once an emotional decision is made, no logical argument has real power. A man doesn't change his mind, he changes his narrative. You've probably witnessed this in a professional setting. A leader makes a clearly wrong decision. The signs appear early. Results plummet, people leave, conflicts arise. Yet he persists. Not because he rationally believes in it, but because admitting the mistake would mean losing status, authority, or the image he has built. Machiavelli wouldn't be surprised. For him, maintaining appearances almost always wins over the pursuit of truth. The Stoic once again observes without deluding himself. The ego prefers to crumble slowly, rather than admit a failure immediately. There is something profoundly disturbing yet liberating about this realization. Disturbing because it destroys the fantasy that simply presenting good arguments is enough to change people. Liberating because it removes an unrealistic expectation. Machiavelli doesn't advise you to fight against this mechanism. He suggests that you understand it. Those who understand that humans are driven by emotions stop demanding rationality where it doesn't exist. And this completely changes how they position themselves in the world. Imagine a common situation, an argument, two people defending opposing points of view, each convinced that logic is on their side. The tone rises, the atmosphere becomes tense, and no one leaves convinced. What was truly at stake was never the argument itself. It was the feeling of being respected, heard, validated. Machiavelli knew that those who win these debates are not those with the best data, but those who understand the emotional terrain of the conversation. The Stoic, on the other hand, does not allow himself to be swayed. He chooses when to speak and when to remain silent, because he knows that not every conflict is rationally solvable. There's a silent shift that occurs when you accept this truth. You stop trying to save people from repeating their own mistakes. You stop getting frustrated because someone doesn't follow obvious advice. You stop wasting energy trying to convince those who don't want to change. Machiavelli wouldn't call it coldness, but lucidity. The Stoic would call it emotional economy. Both would agree. Expending energy where there is no openness is a waste. Perhaps the most visible example is in consumption. People who say they want financial stability, but repeatedly make impulsive decisions. Small purchases justified as deserved accumulate in a pattern that sabotages any long-term plan. When confronted, they feel attacked. The reaction is not reflection, it is defense. Machiavelli saw in this the absolute dominance of immediate pleasure. The Stoic observes and concludes, without inner control, there is no external freedom. There is also an element of mystery in all of this, something that is rarely spoken aloud. Many prefer not to change because change would force them to take full responsibility for their own lives. While the decision is attributed to emotion, chance, or circumstances, the weight is less. Machiavelli realized that man often chooses his own limitation because it offers a comfortable excuse. The Stoic understands that this choice exacts a silent price, the gradual loss of self-control. When you begin to see this pattern, something changes in the way you look at people, not with contempt, but with conscious distance. You realize that most people don't want to be convinced. They want to be comforted. They don't want truth. They want emotional consistency. Machiavelli doesn't ask you to despise this. He asks you to take it into account. Ignoring this dynamic doesn't make you more virtuous, only more vulnerable. And here arises an uncomfortable question, one that few dare to sustain for long. If people act this way, how should you act? Continue expecting rationality where there is emotion, or adjust your posture so as not to be dragged along by unrealistic expectations? Stoicism offers the foundation. Control what is under your control, accept the rest. Machiavelli offers the complement. Use this understanding so as not to be surprised, betrayed, or manipulated by those who act exactly as human nature allows. There is an almost imperceptible moment when the observer ceases to be part of the flow and begins to see the flow. It is when you start to notice the micro-gestures, the hesitations, the contradictions between discourse and action. Machiavelli lived in that place, not as someone above others, but as someone who refused willful blindness. The Stoic remains there, calm, without haste to correct the world. This section doesn't end with a solution, because Machiavelli never offered easy solutions. It ends with a warning. If a man acts not out of reason, but out of emotional relief, then every relationship, every promise, and every expectation needs to be viewed in a different light. From this point on, blind trust ceases to be a virtue and becomes a calculated risk. And the next step requires even more coldness. Understanding the limits of human loyalty when emotions, interests, and fear come into conflict. Loyalty is a weighty word. It sounds noble, secure, almost sacred. From an early age, we are taught to treat it as the supreme virtue, as if it were an absolute value, immune to time, circumstances, and human change. Machiavelli never accepted this fantasy. He observed something that few dare to admit. Loyalty is not born of morality. It is born of balance. Where this balance is broken, loyalty rots silently, but continues to be demanded as if it were still alive. In everyday life, this appears almost invisibly. A longtime friend begins to disappear when you cease to be useful. A company extols values and speeches while coldly calculating who should be discarded. A relationship demands unilateral commitment, but secretly keeps doors open. Machiavelli didn't see this as exceptional betrayal. He saw it as normal functioning when interests change. The mistake, for him, is not in loyalty failing, but in believing that it fails by chance. If loyalty were truly unconditional, why does it almost always end when the cost increases? Why do so many relationships only last as long as they are comfortable? And why are we taught to blame ourselves when we remain faithful to those who have already abandoned us in silence? Most people confuse loyalty with attachment. The Stoic already warned, clinging to what doesn't depend on you is giving up your own stability. Machiavelli goes further and observes that this attachment is exploitable. The man who declares himself loyal at any cost communicates something dangerous to the world, that he is willing to pay alone for a contract that requires two sides. And such contracts always attract opportunists. There's a recurring image in human stories: the individual who continues giving, even when they no longer receive. He calls this character. Others call it expediency. Machiavelli observed these dynamics in courts, armies, and political alliances. The setting changes, the characters change, but the pattern repeats itself. Where there is no reciprocity, dependence arises. Where there is dependence, imbalance is born. Where there is imbalance, someone always loses. How many times have you defended someone who wasn't there to defend you? How many times have you justified other people's actions while ignoring your own burnout? And at what point did this stop being a virtue and become a fear of breaking away? There's a point rarely discussed. Many remain loyal not out of honor but out of fear of facing the emptiness that comes after a break. Loyalty becomes an emotional shield. It's better to suffer within something known than to face the unknown alone. Machiavelli saw this with uncomfortable clarity. For him, man fears instability more than injustice. The Stoic recognizes this fear as natural, but not as justifiable. Machiavelli wrote that it is safer to be feared than loved when one cannot be both. Many interpret this superficially, as if it were an invitation to cruelty. It is not. It is a warning about the fragility of love when it is not based on respect, strength, and perceived value. Love, when unaccompanied by limits, dissolves. Loyalty, when unaccompanied by consequences, becomes disposable. Observe how people react when they realize you don't break ties easily. First come the requests, then the demands, finally the disrespect. Not because they are bad, but because the absence of boundaries communicates permission. Machiavelli didn't condemn these people. He warned those who put themselves in that position. For him, not setting clear boundaries is a strategic error, not a demonstration of kindness. If loyalty were truly rewarded on its own, why do so many upright men end up marginalized? Why is it that those who never break up are often the first to be broken up? And why is the word ungrateful often used by those who gave too much without considering the return? There is something almost cruel in Machiavellian lucidity, but also profoundly liberating. It removes the veil of romanticization. True loyalty doesn't need to be proclaimed. It is sustained by mutual interest, respect, and strength. When one of these pillars falls, the relationship transforms, even if the discourse remains the same. Ignoring this doesn't preserve the bond. It only prolongs the illusion. In the professional environment, this manifests itself clearly. Companies talk about family while making purely rational decisions. The loyal worker believes that years of dedication guarantee protection. Machiavelli would observe, protection has never been guaranteed, only negotiated. The Stoic would add, confusing expectation with reality is a sure source of suffering. Those who understand this prepare themselves. Those who don't understand are surprised. There is a silent revelation here. The most dangerous loyalty is the one that cannot be withdrawn. When you cling to an identity of always loyal, you lose freedom of movement. Machiavelli saw this as strategic vulnerability. The man who cannot break free is predictable, and predictability in any human game is weakness. Have you ever noticed how people change their behavior when they feel they might lose you? Have you noticed how respect arises when the possibility of absence becomes real? And why does this seem uncomfortable, almost wrong, if we've been taught that loyalty means staying put no matter what. Stoicism teaches that nothing external is permanent. Machiavelli applies this idea to human relationships without sentimentality. He understands that alliances exist as long as they make sense for both parties. When they cease to do so, insisting does not restore balance. It only shifts the weight to one side, and whoever carries the weight alone sooner or later bends. There's an unexpected shift when you accept this. You start paying more attention to promises than to words. You begin to evaluate actions over time, not emotional declarations. You come to understand that loyalty isn't asked for, begged for, or bought. It emerges when there's perceived value on both sides, and it disappears when that value vanishes. This doesn't make you cold, it makes you lucid. Machiavelli never advocated gratuitous abandonment, but condemned blind loyalty. The Stoic doesn't abandon impulsively, but neither does he sacrifice himself for illusions. Both converge on one point. The dignity of man lies in consciously choosing where he remains. If you remove the excessive romanticism from loyalty, what's left? Respect, exchange, boundaries, consequences. And perhaps that's what has always been there, hidden by convenient speeches. This part doesn't conclude the matter. It delves deeper into the subject, because understanding loyalty as an implicit contract leads to something even more sensitive. How you are perceived when you decide to stay, when you decide to leave, and when you decide not to explain. From this point on, reputation ceases to be a matter of chance and becomes a silent construction. And it is at this point that Machiavelli becomes even more dangerous for those who prefer to remain asleep. Most people believe that reputation is a consequence. Machiavelli knew that it is a cause. Even before someone hears your voice, before knowing your intentions or understanding your motivations, an image already exists, operating silently. This image determines which doors open, which resistances arise, and which concessions appear unbidden. The average person lives as if reputation were something spontaneous. Machiavelli observed that it is built, maintained, and often destroyed by almost invisible details. There is a little-discussed episode in the Italian courts that illustrates this precisely. A respected advisor, known for his intelligence and loyalty, began to lose influence without understanding why. His ideas remained sound, his arguments coherent, yet they stopped listening to him. Machiavelli would bluntly state the reason. He began to over-explain. Every decision was accompanied by lengthy justifications, preemptive defenses, attempts to be understood. The content didn't change, but the perception did. In the eyes of others, someone who over-explains conveys insecurity, even when they are right. This pattern doesn't belong to the past. Look at the present. How many times have you seen someone competent lose authority, not because they failed, but because they tried to convince everyone all the time? How many times has someone silent, almost invisible, come to be respected precisely because they didn't feel the need to prove themselves? Machiavelli understood something that few accept. Reputation is not built on what you say about yourself, but on the space you occupy when you say nothing. There is curious data in modern studies of social psychology that confirm this. People who speak less in strategic meetings, but intervene in a timely and precise manner, are perceived as more intelligent and trustworthy than those who contribute all the time. It's not the volume of words that builds reputation, it's the weight. Machiavelli didn't need statistics to know this. He saw the dynamics in action every day. Another unlikely, yet recurring phenomenon involves figures who rise rapidly and fall just as quickly. The reason is rarely technical incompetence. More often than not, it's overexposure. The person becomes predictable, too accessible, too explainable. Everything is on display. Machiavelli knew that mystery is not manipulation, it's protection. The Stoic would agree, not everything that is true needs to be revealed. There is a nearly universal mistake, confusing transparency with moral strength. Excessive transparency in practice often becomes public weakness. When you reveal all your conflicts, doubts, and dilemmas to anyone, you provide material for judgments, labels, and distortions. Machiavelli did not advocate lying, but he did advocate control. Control of the narrative is control of perception, and perception, in human relations, is often worth more than objective reality. Observe how experienced leaders handle crises. They don't explain every detail. They don't engage in emotional debates. They communicate what is necessary at the right time, with firmness. This isn't coldness, it's an understanding of how people function. Machiavelli would say that those who try to be loved by everyone end up being respected by no one. The Stoic would add that those who depend on external validation lose their inner balance. There are curious historical accounts of rulers who maintained authority even in their absence. Their mere mention was enough to dictate behavior. This didn't stem from physical strength, but from the consistency of the image built over time. Reputation acts like a shadow that precedes the man. When that shadow is firm, the body doesn't need to exert itself as much. When it's weak, no effort is worthwhile. In everyday life, this manifests itself subtly. Someone arrives late repeatedly and offers elaborate apologies. Another arrives late once, doesn't over-explain, and corrects their behavior. The second person maintains respect. The first accumulates justifications and loses credibility. Machiavelli would observe that the problem is not the mistake itself, but how it is managed in the collective perception. There is also a curious fact. People who never publicly complain about their problems are seen as more competent, even when facing similar difficulties to others. Not because they suffer less, but because they don't transform suffering into an identity. Machiavelli understood that turning fragility into constant discourse corrodes reputation. The Stoic would call this a lack of inner control. Another unlikely event occurs when someone decides to silently withdraw from a toxic environment. No announcements, no accusations, no dramatic explanations. They simply leave. The impact is usually greater than any confrontation. The void generates questions. The questions generate reflection. Machiavelli knew that a well-placed absence communicates more power than a desperate presence. Reputation is also revealed in what you tolerate. People silently observe how far you allow yourself to be disrespected. Every unlimited concession redefines who you are in that environment. Machiavelli didn't believe that respect is born from speeches about values, but from the consistency between behavior and consequences. The man who accepts everything teaches others to surpass him. There's an interesting psychological fact. When someone sets clear boundaries and upholds them without anger, they tend to be more respected than someone who oscillates between emotional outbursts and permissiveness. This confirms something Machiavelli already knew. Emotional predictability weakens. Predictability of character strengthens. Being firm doesn't require aggression. It requires consistency. In social contexts, reputation is also linked to scarcity. People who are always available lose symbolic value, not because they are less human, but because unrestricted access reduces the perception of importance. Machiavelli saw this in the courts, where rare advisors were listened to more than those who were always present. The Stoic understands, being always accessible means giving up one's own internal agenda. There's something almost paradoxical about all this. The less you try to directly control other people's opinions, the more indirect control you exert. The less you explain yourself, the more weight your gestures gain. The less you react impulsively, the more your presence imposes itself. Machiavelli wouldn't call this manipulation, but a correct understanding of human nature. Perhaps the most surprising account is this. Many men lose their reputation not for doing something wrong, but for trying to be understood by those who have no interest in understanding them. Every explanation offered to someone who doesn't matter dilutes their authority. Machiavelli saw this as a common strategic flaw. The Stoic would say it's a waste of energy. When you begin to realize this, something changes irreversibly. You start to choose better where you speak, where you remain silent, where you stay, and where you withdraw. Your reputation ceases to be an accident and becomes the consequence of conscious decisions. Not impulsive decisions, not emotional reactions, but choices aligned with a long-term vision. This part doesn't conclude the construction. It delves deeper into the psychological terrain where the image is consolidated. Because understanding reputation is only the beginning. The real test arises when that image is challenged, when interests clash, when conflict becomes inevitable. And it is precisely there that many, even consciously, reveal whether they were prepared or merely well-positioned until then. There is a specific moment when the illusion of stability shatters. It doesn't usually come with a warning. Sometimes it appears as a cut-off conversation, an unexpected decision, a look that changes tone. Other times, it arrives as silence. Machiavelli understood this moment better than anyone else. the point at which conflict ceases to be an abstract possibility and becomes a concrete reality, not because someone chose to fight, but because interests, fears, and ambitions finally collided. Most people believe that conflict is the exception, something undesirable, abnormal, avoidable. Machiavelli observed the opposite. For him, conflict is the natural state of human relations when resources, attention, power, or recognition are at stake. The error lies not in its existence, but in its denial. Whoever believes that harmony is permanent lives unarmed, and whoever lives unarmed, sooner or later, pays a price they did not choose. Think about how many times you've been surprised. A colleague who seemed neutral starts competing openly. An ally changes position when they perceive an advantage on the other side. A previously friendly environment becomes hostile without clear explanation. The shock doesn't come from the conflict itself, but from the belief that it shouldn't exist. Machiavelli was never shocked. He waited. The Stoic, too. Both knew that excessive tranquility usually precedes rupture. There is a silent tension that precedes every confrontation. Small, almost imperceptible signs, tested limits, ambiguous comments, strategic delays, changes in behavior. Most ignore these signs because they wish to preserve the feeling of normalcy. Machiavelli saw in these details the true battlefield. Those who perceive it early rarely need to fight. Those who perceive it late almost always lose more than they imagine. Herein lies the first mental shift. A man prepared for conflict rarely needs to engage in it, not because he is more aggressive, but because his posture communicates readiness. People choose easy targets. They avoid those who demonstrate clarity, firmness, and responsiveness. Machiavelli understood that strength lies not only in action, but in the reputation of acting when necessary. The Stoic adds, "True calmness comes not from the absence of danger, but from the ability to face it." Observe leaders who navigate crises without falling apart. They don't panic. They don't over-explain. They don't play the victim. They maintain their pace, adjust their course, and set limits. This posture doesn't emerge in the moment of crisis. It arises much earlier, in silent preparation. Machiavelli insisted on this. Those who only prepare when conflict arises are already behind schedule. There is an uncomfortable truth here. Many conflicts don't start out big. They grow because someone hesitated, because someone tried to please, because someone confused patience with passivity. Every unthinking concession expands the opponent's territory. Machiavelli wouldn't call it bad luck, but a misreading. The Stoic would say it's a lack of discernment between what can be tolerated and what needs to be contained. There is also internal conflict, perhaps the most dangerous. It's the moment when you know you need to act, but hesitate for fear of losing approval, comfort, or image. Machiavelli saw this conflict as decisive. Those who don't resolve their own indecision end up reacting too late to external movements. The man who does not govern himself becomes governable by any pressure. Imagine a common situation. Someone crosses a small line. You notice, but let it go. The behavior repeats itself, a little more intensely. You feel uncomfortable, but remain silent. When you finally decide to act, the other person already feels entitled to go further. The conflict explodes, and everyone wonders why it got so serious. Machiavelli would answer bluntly, because the limit wasn't imposed when it was still simple. This is the turning point that few accept. Avoiding small conflicts creates major confrontations. The Stoic understands that momentary discomfort can prevent prolonged suffering. Machiavelli transforms this into strategy. He doesn't seek conflict, but he doesn't run from it when necessary. He knows that the absence of a response communicates weakness, and weakness invites attack. There are curious historical accounts of rulers who lost everything not because of grand battles, but because of initial hesitations. A territory ceded to avoid war, a concession made to preserve peace, an agreement held beyond what was reasonable. Each retreat seemed sensible in isolation. The end result was total loss. Machiavelli recorded these patterns with almost cruel precision. Those who yield out of fear end up fighting in worse conditions. In everyday life, this translates more simply. A professional who accepts extra tasks without questioning until they become overwhelmed and disrespected. A partner who tolerates repeated behaviors until the relationship becomes unbalanced. An individual who avoids saying no until no is ever heard again. Machiavelli saw this not as kindness but as a lack of strategy. The Stoic would call it a craving for approval. There is increasing tension when you start acting differently, when you set boundaries, when you refuse certain demands, when you don't react as expected. Some people withdraw, others test you even further. This is where many retreat, frightened by the initial reaction. Machiavelli would warn, this is the decisive moment. If you maintain your stance, the conflict dissipates. If you retreat, you confirm the perceived weakness. The unexpected twist is this: well-managed conflict strengthens one's position. It doesn't destroy valuable relationships, it merely filters them. Those who remain after clear boundaries are established tend to respect them. Those who withdraw reveal that the relationship depended on their constant concessions. Machiavelli didn't lament these losses. He considered them enlightening. The pace quickens when you understand that preparation isn't paranoia, it's lucidity. Saving resources when everything is going well. Developing skills when they aren't needed. Building alternatives before you need them. The Stoic sees this as prudence. Machiavelli sees it as strategic survival. Both agree. Those who depend on a single path live under constant threat. There's an interesting psychological fact. People who demonstrate the ability to withdraw without drama have a greater impact than those who confront excessively. The possibility of absence creates more reflection than a conflictive presence. Machiavelli knew this effect intuitively. The Stoic practices it naturally. Knowing when to leave is as important as knowing when to stay. As the conflict nears its peak, something changes internally. Fear ceases to dominate. Clarity increases. You realize that many threats were greater in the imagination than in reality. Machiavelli knew this. Man fears conflict more before it happens than during it. After the stance is taken, the weight diminishes. The Stoic would say that this occurs when the mind accepts the inevitable. This section leads you to the final threshold, the point where conflict is no longer avoided or provoked, but simply managed with firmness, where reaction gives way to conscious choice, where tension ceases to paralyze and begins to organize. Machiavelli is there observing, not to incite struggle but to remind us. Those who prepare are rarely surprised, and those who understand conflict cease to fear it. What remains now is the final layer, the one that unites everything seen so far. Because understanding emotion, loyalty, reputation, and conflict is not enough if man does not integrate this into a final stance before the world. The conclusion does not speak of external victory, but of something more silent and definitive. The inner strength that prevents you from being manipulated, ignored, or dragged back into comfortable illusions. There's a rare moment when everything falls into place. Not like a mystical revelation, but like an inner silence where the pieces finally stop fighting each other. It's when you realize you no longer need to react as before, that something has changed in the way you observe, interpret, and decide. Machiavelli never promised peace. Stoicism never promised comfort. Both point to something more solid, clarity. And clarity, when it arrives, makes no noise. It simply makes it impossible to go back to being what you were. Throughout everything that has been presented, an invisible thread has been present. The understanding that the world is not organized around justice, intention, or isolated goodness, but around perceptions, forces, and choices. This is not an invitation to empty cynicism, nor to inhuman coldness. It is a call to personal responsibility, because from the moment you understand how things work, you can no longer pretend you don't know. The Stoic begins from within. He asks what is under his control and what is not. Machiavelli follows closely and asks something even more direct. How are you being perceived while you act, speak, remain silent, or yield? When these two questions come together, a practical path is born. Not a closed manual, but a stance towards life. A way of walking that reduces surprises, avoids emotional traps, and returns to the individual something that many have lost without realizing it: autonomy. Putting all of this into practice doesn't require speeches, constant confrontations, or abrupt changes. It requires daily attention. It begins by observing your own reactions before trying to correct the world. Whenever you feel the urge to over-explain, ask yourself if you are seeking clarity or approval. Whenever you feel guilty about setting a limit, question whether that guilt is moral or simply a fear of losing something that perhaps wasn't secure to begin with. Whenever you feel the need to convince someone, ask yourself if that person truly wants to understand or simply be comforted. There is a silent transformation when you stop trying to save others from themselves. You save energy, You gain time, you gain presence. The Stoic would call this inner mastery. Machiavelli would call it practical intelligence. Both would agree that insisting where there is no opening is not a virtue, it's a waste. From that point on, you begin to choose better where you invest your loyalty, your word, your patience. Another concrete application lies in how you build your image without becoming a prisoner of it. It's not about acting, but about being selective. Not every truth needs to be shared. Not every pain needs to be exposed. Not every decision needs to be explained. When you understand this, your presence changes. People feel it. They can't explain it, but they perceive it. And perception, as you've already seen, is the ground where respect and influence grow. In the realm of conflict, the application is even clearer. Don't wait for major crises to act. Observe the small signs. Tested boundaries are silent invitations. Responding early, firmly, and calmly avoids unnecessary confrontations later. This doesn't mean hardening your heart, but aligning your stance and consequences. The Stoic accepts momentary discomfort to preserve long-term stability. Machiavelli reinforces this. Those who avoid small conflicts end up facing great losses. There is also a profound adjustment in the relationship with fear. Fear doesn't disappear, it changes its role. Before, it controlled your actions. Now it becomes a signal that something important is at stake. Instead of paralyzing, it guides. Instead of confusing, it alerts. You learn not to act impulsively, but also not to hide behind passivity. This balance is not natural. It is trained, observed, and corrected over time. Perhaps the most significant change is this. You stop seeking external validation as your primary compass. This doesn't mean isolation or indifference. It means your reference point becomes internal. You act in alignment with your understanding of reality, not with the expectations of others. The Stoic finds his tranquility there. Machiavelli finds his effectiveness there. When these two forces meet, a person ceases to be predictable to others and becomes reliable to himself. It's important to state something clearly. This path doesn't make you immune to losses, rejections, or conflicts. It makes you less surprised by them. And there's a huge difference between suffering from illusion and facing difficulties with clarity. A conscious man may lose a position, a relationship, an opportunity, but he doesn't lose himself in the process. That's what Machiavelli, deep down, always wanted to preserve. If you've made it this far, something within you has already changed. Perhaps you don't yet know exactly how to apply all of this, but the seed has been planted. From now on, each interaction will be observed with a little more distance. Each promise will be listened to with a little more attention. Each choice will be made with less haste and more intention. This doesn't make you superior to anyone. It makes you less manipulable. And that, in a world of appearances and impulses, is a silent form of freedom. Before we conclude, take one last honest moment to reflect. How many decisions in your life have been made to avoid immediate discomfort, even if it would cost you dearly later? How many times have you ignored clear signs for fear of seeming harsh, selfish, or different? And most importantly, what changes from now on, knowing all this? Machiavelli wouldn't be here to applaud you. He didn't believe in applause. He would silently observe what you do with that understanding. The Stoic, too, both know that knowledge without application is merely sophisticated entertainment. The real difference begins when you act differently, even when no one is watching. If this content resonated with you, please like the video. This simple gesture helps spread the message to others who may also need to hear it. If you wish, feel free to comment. You can do so publicly or anonymously, simply stating what it evoked in you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now. This channel exists to delve into exactly this type of reflection, showing how to think clearly in a world that rewards distraction. This wasn't the end, it was the turning point.